Welcome, friends, to Beyond the Crucible, the podcast that dares to talk about setback and failure, but not so we can commiserate. It's so we can elevate. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our mission today is to offer you the hope that your crucible experiences, which we speak of as those tragedies, challenges, trials, and setbacks that you face or might even be facing right now, those do not define you. They refine you. They didn't happen to you. They happened for you. And I don't know many people, probably none, certainly none, who know that better than the founder of Beyond the Crucible, the host of this show, and my friend, Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, I'm really looking forward to this episode because this subject is one I know has been near and dear to your heart since your heart was encased in a boy's body. This has been something that's been truly has been a lifelong pursuit and passion of yours, the subject of today's episode. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
I'm definitely looking forward to this discussion. You're right. This is somebody that we'll be discussing. I've had a significant interest in my whole life, so it'll be a very good discussion, I think.
I agree. And folks, it's been a while since we've been here, so let me level set us on what we're doing. We're doing another episode of what we call stories from the book Crucible Leadership. And this episode is Winston Churchill on perseverance. And the idea behind this series, we're calling it the series within the show, is that once a month, and it's been since February since we've done it because we had our Trials to Triumph self-assessment spring series. But we're back now in the rhythm of doing this. And we've decided to do this because Warwick's book, Crucible Leadership, released in 2022. It's important because it's the book that birthed the business. There'd be no Beyond the Crucible if there was no Crucible Leadership, the book. And the idea here is that we're spotlighting one feature story from the book, where it talks a lot about historical and military leaders in the book, political leaders in the book. We're taking one story from their life, unpacked in the book, and we're going to unpack it and the lessons about how you can move beyond your crucibles so that you can apply those lessons to your own life. And as I said, this month, we are going to talk about Winston Churchill, and I'm going to silence myself now because I know that Mr. Fairfax is excited to talk about this. So I'm going to throw the first question at you, Warwick. You have been fascinated by Churchill since you were a boy. You're a student of British history. Why are you now and have you been so interested in Winston Churchill?
Well, my father was an Anglophile. He loved everything English. In fact, when I was growing up, cricket's a big deal in Australia, and the Ashes cricket series between Australia and England, he would actually cheer for England, which drove me insane because, it'd be like, I don't know, being a Cubs fan and your dad cheers for the Cardinals or something. It's just like, no, it's the wrong team. You don't do stuff like that. So,
well, and in my family, you've just described what would have been patricide if my dad was a Cardinals fan. So I get it. Thank you for helping me understand that.
So, but really, my ancestors on my dad's side came out to Australia from England in the 1830s. And so I grew up hearing stories of great British heroes, people like the Duke of Wellington, Lord Horatio Nelson in the Napoleonic Wars of the late 1700s, early 1800s, and of course, Winston Churchill of World War II fame. My dad loved history, so the way we bonded is stories of history. So when I was 11, there was a movie that came out in 1972 called Young Winston. So here I am, even before then, groomed on stories of great British heroes like Winston Churchill. Out comes this movie, of course I have to see it. And it's a movie about Winston Churchill's early years. It shows him as the son of the famous British politician, Lord Randolph Churchill, charismatic, that are most likely to succeed, but unfortunately got a debilitating illness that robbed him of his mental faculties, and he ended up dying young, never really achieving the ultimate goal of, I guess, any politician, would, at least in the British system, to be prime minister. So he was somebody that, in some sense, Winston Churchill greatly admired. And actually, Winston Churchill's grandfather, his dad's father, was the Duke of Marlborough, of Blenheim Palace fame, and just one of the most magnificent, aristocratic houses, palaces, even in all of Britain. So famed lineage. Now, his mother was the former Jenny Jerome, an American heiress. Back in the day, if you were an aristocrat, it cost a lot of money to keep up the houses on the estate. In the 1800s, it wasn't uncommon to find an American heiress. It's kind of what you did back in the day. So anyway, so Churchill, much to his father's disappointment, never did well in school. He went to Sandhurst, which is sort of like the West Point of Britain. It took him about 2 or 3 tries to get in. He became a war correspondent in several places, including the Boer War, which was between the British forces and the Dutch, settlers in South Africa. And then he ended up entering politics. So there was something about Winston Churchill in some way that I could identify, growing up in a very privileged background, having a famous father, wanting to make your father proud, wanting to have an impact for good, if you will. Ultimately, I think what many of us are familiar with is how Winston Churchill stood up to the might of Nazi Germany in World War II. That's where his legend was really born, if you will. So, yeah, from an early age, Winston Churchill, that movie Young Winston, which in some ways I felt like I could identify with in terms of a lineage and aristocratic background, if you will, and desire to have an impact. And so I was sort of reared in the legend of Churchill, and I've been fascinated by him my whole life.
And speaking of the legend of Churchill, I want to read a little quote from your book where you talk about him, because you sort of set the on-ramp into our discussion in this paragraph from your book. You wrote this about him. You said, Churchill's success in life in the broadest sense is the stuff of legend. He was not afraid to dare greatly. He was a doer of deeds. He devoted himself fully to the political fray and the causes he championed. He was always in the arena, and he was even knocked down. He was often knocked down and bloody. We're going to talk about that, folks. But he always got up and would indeed spend himself for a worthy cause. Churchill is, you write in the book, the very epitome of perseverance.
I love what you just read. I know I kind of wrote it, but it reminds me of that quote by former President Teddy Roosevelt, talking about daring greatly, and the man in the arena, so to speak, the person in the arena. And certainly when you think of Winston Churchill, he was not always right about everything. Who is in terms of history is look at his policies. Most people would say he was right to oppose Nazi Germany. Obviously, there were other issues he didn't get right, but you could never say that he lacked passion or conviction. He wasn't always right, but he was not a passive person sitting on the sidelines. He was always in the arena, giving it all 100%. And that you have to admire about him. He dared greatly. He was a man of action, a man of passion, and he was not passive. So other than perseverance, which we'll talk about, there's a lot to admire about how he led his whole life. He was never one to sit on the sidelines, never one to sit in bed saying, life's challenging. I don't think I'll really enter the fray today. No. Every day, as that Shakespeare play says, once more into the breach, dear friends. I think it's Henry V or something. I mean, that was Churchill. Okay, it's a new day. It's a new day to enter the fray and fight the good fight. A lot of people like that are worthy of admiration.
Yeah. And just to show you that I have some appreciation for Churchill, one of the things, I wrote a book on the films of James Bond, and one of the key elements of the last few films of James Bond was a thing that Em had on her desk, which was a bulldog. Here it is. It looks like Winston Churchill. If you're on YouTube, folks, you can see, here's the bulldog. But take a look at the bulldog's face. The bulldog knew a crucible or two. He's been glued back together. he was glued back together. This one is was built that way, but it signifies that the Bulldog went through a crucible in that MI6 blew up and the Bulldog was broken on M's desk. So that's just to show you I have a love of Churchill, and that my love of Churchill is represented by a bulldog, a porcelain bulldog who went through some crucibles. So now let's talk about work. One of the things that really impressed you about Churchill was his perseverance, right? It was his leadership was dotted constantly, even painted with perseverance, more than dotted. It happened. He needed to summon his perseverance a lot. What were the main crucibles he faced in his life, and how did he bounce forward from them?
You know, Winston Churchill had a life of crucibles, if you will. From the beginning of Churchill's political career, life was not easy. It was his dream of entering politics beside his famous father. But that was never to happen. His father died young of an illness. His father was never to reach the height of his political career, as I mentioned, being prime minister. And so that dream of serving alongside his dad, that never happened. So that, in a sense, was perhaps the first crucible, as well as his father never really fully embracing his son and never really believing that his son would amount to anything. Obviously, his son proved him very wrong about that one. So Winston Churchill became a Conservative member of Parliament in 1900. And because Churchill was never one to be conventional, he went over to the other side, to the Liberal Party, becoming a member of Parliament in 1906. Now, the Liberal Party was the more progressive left-wing party, if you will, and obviously Conservative Party more right-wing. But there were some policies that Churchill agreed with, whether in terms of providing, housing to low-income people, and some of the things that the Liberal Party, which was, I guess, center-left party, that he agreed with. And so Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty in World War II, which is the equivalent, basically, of the Secretary of the Navy in the U.S. And the next crucible that happened in his life was in 1915. He was removed from his post as First Lord of the Admiralty after the disastrous Battle of Gallipoli, which is in Turkey. At the time, in World War I, Turkey was a member of the Axis, along with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Ironically, it was in Gallipoli where the Australian and New Zealand forces, the Anzacs, served, and with incredible bravery, but because the whole thing was poorly led, poorly thought out, it was a dismal failure, but a tremendous mark of heroism in the Australian and New Zealand forces. Now, without getting into too much detail, it really wasn't Churchill's fault. It was more the fault of the generals and admirals on scene who were planning the battle. But as you know, in the world of public relations and life isn't always fair.
That's
Sometimes true. You get accused of doing something wrong and are blamed, even when it really wasn't your fault. And that was the case here.
I'll stop you there, Warwick, only to say it's the kind of crucible, even though, I don't know how many elected officials we have who are listening and watching, but it's the kind of professional crucible that so many people know so well, right? You lose a job. Maybe it's not completely your fault that you lost the job. Maybe your boss has made you a scapegoat in some way, or that's how it feels. I mean, that's a lot of what we're going to talk about with Churchill. In one sense, you can think, oh my gosh, I'll never experience that. But boiled down to its root, what we're talking about here is a guy who had a professional crucible. He lost a job, and that was very debilitating to his sense of self. So I just wanted to make that point for folks so that they can connect to the story even better.
No, I think it's a very fair point. So then in 1922, Churchill actually lost his seat in Parliament. He was rushed to the hospital for an appendix operation. And then in the 1920s, the Liberal Party was in decline. It was a center-left party, and the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, came to rise. It was also, left-wing party, perhaps not quite so center-left. And so Churchill at that point figured, well, obviously he's not a Labour Party person. He was more, wasn't as left-wing as the Labour Party was. So Churchill, rejoins the Conservative Party in 1925. He becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is, roughly speaking, Secretary of the Treasury. And it's a position that his dad had held years before. Even though it was only brief, somehow in Churchill's mind, he's living part of his dad's legacy. It was a very emotional moment in his life when he became Chancellor of the Exchequer in the late 1920s. So in 1929, arguably the toughest period in Churchill's personal life came about. So he was out of office during that time. He was out of favor with the Conservative Party. And this has been called by historians and others his wilderness years. I think for a lot of us, we've probably had a time in our life that has felt like our wilderness years, where it felt like down in our luck and things have not gone our way. Maybe a marriage is broken up, maybe a death in the family, maybe a loss of a job. Just that phrase, wilderness years, just the emotion behind it, I think resonates with a lot of us. So during the 1929 stock market crash, Churchill lost a considerable amount of money. He happened to be visiting New York in 1931, in New York City. And obviously he's used to driving on the other side of the road in Britain. So he looked the wrong way before crossing the road, and he was hit by a car and badly injured. So in a short period of time, he had lost a lot of money. He was out of political power. He was badly injured. And then we have Adolf Hitler rising to power, capturing the chancellorship of Germany in 1933. So here we have Churchill going through all of these crucibles, if you will, physical, political, and then here we have Adolf Hitler rising to power. And Churchill was in the unenviable position of being on the sidelines against the pacifism that took hold of Britain, and in fact, a lot of the war, including the US at the time. People, I guess, didn't seem to take Adolf Hitler seriously. I didn't really view him as enough of a threat, or as much of a threat, and obviously he'll prove to be. So the 1930s were the toughest time in his life, and at least personally in a lot of ways. But Churchill's reputation began to rise in the late 30s over the British government's handling of the German invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938 and the British government's appeasement of Hitler. So in September 1939, Hitler invades Poland and World War II begins. Churchill was invited to accept his old post of First Lord of the Admiralty, along with a seat in the War Cabinet. And, in a lot of movies, I think Dunkirk and one or two other, I think there was another movie, maybe his Finest Hour. There's been a couple of World War II movies about Churchill in the last 10 years. And there's a great scene in one of them in which a telex or a telegram goes out to the British fleet. And it basically says, Winston is back. So he was so beloved by the military because they knew that he took Hitler seriously. They knew he's somebody that'll have our back. He's somebody that gets us. So he was back. World War I, he was First Lord of the Admiralty. Now in World War II, he's First Lord of the Admiralty. That message, Winston's back, it tells you everything you need to know about how the Navy and the military viewed Winston Churchill. And even before he'd really done a huge amount, he hadn't become prime minister yet, if you will, they just felt this sense of peace is back. So then Churchill, in May 1940, was invited to become prime minister after Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigned, and Churchill reached the pinnacle of his career. He became prime minister, something his father was never able to achieve. So the next crucible, at least personally in his life, obviously the whole war years was an incredible crucible, as we'll see here in a bit, how Winston Churchill, almost alone in some ways in the early years of the war, tried to fight against the Nazi Germany. It was sort of Britain and the Commonwealth against the might of Nazi Germany. It was an unbelievable crucible. But from a personal perspective, the last crucible that he went through, perhaps, or the last defining crucible, was in July 1945. A few months after Germany surrendered, Churchill lost the election. The Labour Party won in a landslide because they promised peace, full employment, national health care. It's not like the British people didn't appreciate Winston Churchill, but the war was over. They wanted peace. They wanted to move on. it's completely understandable why they would vote for the Labour Party. It was promising, a better life, peace, and prosperity. It made sense in a lot of ways. But still, Churchill, you would have thought, must have thought, I helped win World War II, and the people vote me out of office? Seriously? Come on. I mean, what did I do? I mean, is there something I should have done better? I mean, come on. Again, people can probably relate to that. Sometimes you get fired, and it's like, but all I did was do a good job. What is the problem here? But as we'll see, somehow Churchill didn't really hold a grudge. But that was really a defining crucible in Churchill's life. And then what's really amazing is how Churchill showed remarkable perseverance in dealing with all these crucibles. He was never one to give up or feel sorry for himself. He always moved on and kept fighting for the things that he believed in. So it's just an incredible legacy. I mean, just the amount of crucibles he went through in his whole life, it was a lot. It's pretty staggering. So he was, in that sense, an expert in how to tackle with crucibles, I suppose, because he had so many of them.
Yeah, and he had to learn what we say at the top of the show in the video version, right? He had to learn that the things that happened didn't happen to him, but they happened for him. He had to do that. So I always say in the video version of the show, Warwick, that I don't know anybody who knows that truth better than you, but I didn't know Churchill, so I guess that's still a true statement. I know of somebody who at least has a few crucibles there. And, it's fascinating. One of the things I dug up a quote that Churchill, from Churchill, in which he talks about what you've just been talking about, the crucibles that he dealt with and we're going to talk about how he moved beyond them, moved forward from them. But he said this, success is the ability to go from one failure to another with no loss of enthusiasm. I mean, that sums up Winston Churchill, doesn't it?
It's such a great quote. I mean, Winston Churchill never lacked enthusiasm. He might have felt down, but he never lacked passion, perseverance. It was, okay, on to the next hill, on to the next battle.
Right.
I can't ever remember reading about Churchill saying, well, I've given up. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to fight for what I believe in. I've had it. The voters have voted me out. I'm going to stay in bed all
day with the covers over my head, right?
Yeah, people don't appreciate me, good riddance. They don't, I could have helped them. He could have really felt self-righteous, sorry for himself. And I'm sure there were times when he was down, but he always kept fighting, kept persevering, kept advocating for the causes he believed in. I don't think there was one day that he didn't get out of bed saying, okay, what do we need to advocate today? Who do I need to talk to? What speech do I need to give? It was always onward, onward. It's just it's remarkable.
Right. Let's then pick up on that point because it is remarkable. Let's talk about what are the keys that allowed him to live that remarkable life and not, you don't not say you won't have Winston Churchill to kick around anymore, right? What led him not to go there, to let him not to wallow in the pit as we talk about? What were the keys to his perseverance?
Gary, there was several. I think the first one to note was his ability to relax and rejuvenate. Even during World War II, I mean, throughout his life, there were times when he found a way to recharge. And, one of the key ways was Churchill had a lifelong love of painting. It started at an early age. In fact, I think when he was a teenager, early 20s, he submitted a painting to, some national painting competition in Britain. And it was like a blind competition in the sense that nobody knew who the painter was. My recollection is he won that. So it wasn't because he grew up with privilege.
Right.
And back then, okay, they may not have known him, but they would have known Lord Randolph Churchill. And they certainly would have known the Duke of Marlborough, one of, if not the most famous aristocratic family outside of the royal family in Britain. It's like, I think we know his family. Yeah. But so over the course of his life, Winston Churchill painted more than 500 canvases. I mean, that's a lot of paintings. And one of the places that he painted his canvases was in a beloved country house he had at Chartwell that he purchased in the 1920s that's not too long a drive outside of London in the county of Kent. So throughout those challenging times in the 30s and during World War II, he would take time to paint and take time to rejuvenate in this beautiful house of Chartwell. So that was certainly one key.
He would also take time. Folks, if you're just listening, head on over to the YouTube version and watch. He was also a big cigar smoker, right? I don't know. He smoked a lot of them. I am now sitting with an enormous cigar.
Yeah.
Just modeling that was one of the ways that he relaxed too. He liked a cigar and liked a glass of bourbon or something like that.
So yeah, there are several different ways you can choose which particular method of perseverance you choose to take.
Yes, amen.
But, another key to Churchill's ability to bounce back and carry on, if you will, it's very British. Keep on, carry on and keep on carrying on. Was his happy marriage and family life. Now, you have to understand that amongst the so-called ruling classes, there were a lot of marriages of convenience or position or, the alignment of powerful families. It wasn't always for love. But Winston Churchill married for love. He was faithful to his wife, Clementine, who he, called Clemmy, his beloved wife. So he had a very happy marriage and family life. Another outlet for him was his writing. And this was critical during his wilderness years, the times when he was out of politics, if you will. So he wrote a book about the First World War that he called The World Crisis. In 1945, after his electoral defeat at the hands of the Labour Party, he wrote his war memoirs about World War II. Now, this book, War Memoirs, was so successful that it sold over 6 million copies in English alone, and in 1953, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. So he was a very successful and accomplished writer. Another key, and this, of all the qualities of perseverance, might be the one that perhaps most astounds me and impresses me, was Winston Churchill's magnanimous and forgiving nature. He wrote a book about his father that was glowing, even though he didn't really have a great relationship with his father. I mean, his father didn't really respect his son that much, didn't really think he would amount to much. And one writer said something to something like, never has somebody written so glowing a portrait of a father who did so little for his son. I mean, it was remarkable. And then Churchill was kind even to his political opponents, people that had caused him so much angst and frustration. So later in 1940, when former Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was ill with terminal cancer, Churchill led him in the government and would call him regularly to give him updates of Allied victories. Now, this is the same Neville Chamberlain who signed the Munich Agreement of Appeasement with Adolf Hitler, who, just did not understand what was happening in the late 30s. If ever there was somebody who Churchill should be aggrieved by, it was Neville Chamberlain, but it wasn't personal. And then Churchill would also take another former prime minister and rival, Stanley Baldwin, to lunch. Stanley Baldwin was prime minister throughout much of the 30s, much of Winston Churchill's wilderness years. Why was Churchill out of power? Well, Baldwin didn't want him in power. He was responsible. And so, again, in the height of the war, Churchill would take his rival to lunch and give him updates. So how somebody could be so magnanimous, not just magnanimous, so kind to people that were former rivals who had retired, I can't think of almost any other politician who's done something like that to their rivals. It was really staggering. So when you look at all these, it's just remarkable, his perseverance. But if you look at some of these keys, his magnanimous nature to rivals, his ability to have a happy family life and a happy marriage, things he could do to get away from the challenges of the war and the wilderness years, of painting and relaxation at his country house Chartwell, his writing. These all add up to some of the keys to his ability to persevere. But of all those, just the ability to not hold grudges, they just hold you down. And so no wonder he was willing to move forward. It's like, well, yesterday was yesterday. I'm not going to worry about what happened then, or, I might disagree vehemently with another politician's position. I'm not going to take it personally. I'm going to get, once more into the fray, dear friends, and let's fight the good fight today. So these are some of the keys to Winston Churchill's, Olympic level of perseverance.
Yes. And here's something that never happens on the show, sarcasm. Always happens on the show. You'll say something and it'll perfectly lead into a point you didn't know I was going to make. I found another quote from Churchill where he talks, which is the perfect capstone to what you were just talking about, the keys behind his perseverance. He said this, and where this quote could be, if it wouldn't be, us stealing from Winston Churchill's quotes, could be the perfect summary of what Beyond the Crucible is all about. He said this: success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. I mean, does that not sum up what we have tried to be about here for 220 some episodes of the show?
It's so well said, Gary. The courage to continue. Every day, each of us who've gone through crucibles, which according to our research is basically 100% of humanity.
Right.
We surveyed people currently, not people throughout the last many thousands of years of human history, but I'm going to make the assumption that life was never easy for human beings. But the courage to continue. Today was a bad day. Like for Churchill, gets voted out of office in the late 20s, get hit by a car in New York in the early 30s. He's out of power. Hitler rises to power. It's like, okay, it wasn't a good day, it wasn't a good few years, but I'm going to have the courage to get in there and advocate for what I believe in. In this particular case, in the early 30s, telling people about the dangers of Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. Don't take this guy lightly. You might mock him and think he's a funny guy with a mustache. He is somebody to be aware of. He is somebody to be afraid of. He's somebody that you need to guard against and protect yourself against. Don't dismiss him as some silly person who you might mock in Germany, as some did. So every day he went into the fray and advocated for what he believed in. So yeah, every day he had the courage to continue. It was remarkable.
And that quote sort of leads into the next question I want to ask you. And I mean, really, for me, the genius of that quote, in addition to the courage to continue, I mean, there's 3 points of genius, but the idea that success is not final is also important to us, for us to remember, right? Just because we've achieved doesn't mean that achievement then is owed to us or it's going to happen all the time, or we don't have to work hard. And he experienced that as well. But that ability to turn a phrase, right? The way that Winston Churchill, the reason that you do a search on Google for Winston Churchill quotes and it returns 197,000 results is because Winston Churchill had a truly remarkable way with words. And you make note in your book, Crucible Leadership, of his skills as an orator being critical to his leadership and perseverance as a leader. In what ways did his skills as a speaker help him to move from trials to triumphs in his life, both public and private?
When people think of Winston Churchill, they think of how he almost single-handedly in the early years of the war helped Britain maintain the fight against the might of Nazi Germany. In those early years, in 1940, in particular, maybe early 41, it was dire. It was Britain and the Commonwealth against the might of Nazi Germany. And in some ways, it was his ability to speak, his oratory, that really inspired a nation, inspired the Commonwealth, inspired the world. And so you look at some of his incredible speeches. I think of the speech he made soon after he became Prime Minister in May 1940. And he gave this speech to Parliament. I would say to the House of Parliament, Churchill said, as I said to those who have joined the government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. In that same speech, he said, victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory, there is no survival. So soon after that, in late May 1940, early June that same year, after 330,000 Allied troops were evacuated from the French coastal town of Dunkirk, Churchill said this, and this is one of his most famous speeches that I think pretty much everybody will remember. He said this, "We shall not flag or fail. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." So the final speech I want to highlight, again, right around this time, it's all within these three great speeches, it's all within like a couple of months. It's kind of remarkable, in 1940. After France surrendered in June 1940, Churchill said this, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour." I mean, that is just incredible. In fact, I think that was the title of a recent movie, The Finest Hour. So, when you look at Churchill's life, his hope, his optimism, his perseverance, it inspired a nation, the Commonwealth, and the world. People just felt like if Winston said it, it must be true. He single-handedly was able, in the British people in particular, to make them feel like, you know what, this is mission possible. Even when all the evidence said this is like one nation and the Commonwealth against the might of Nazi Germany at its height. I mean, there were probably American commentators at the time thinking, gosh, we hope Britain wins, but it's not looking good. I wouldn't put money on Britain. Hate to say this, but I can't believe it, but Germany's in a very good position now. And so the fact with his oratory and just his hope, courage, and perseverance, he inspired a nation to believe, you know what, victory is possible. We can win.
Yeah, and his vision, his skills and talents, all the things that we talk about that go into the recipe for, walking out what our vision for life is, all those things mixed together in Winston Churchill, and we haven't talked about this beforehand, so I'm springing this on you right here live. I mean, what we've talked about so far, we talk about a lot here on the show, Beyond the Crucible in general, this idea of a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. Everything that we've talked about so far, I mean, that is a sterling life of significance that he lived, right?
Absolutely. He lived his whole life for a cause, a purpose beyond himself, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. Churchill wasn't always right about everything, but he fought the good fight, the things that he truly believed in. He would advocate things at times which, politicians typically annoy the other party. I get that.
Right,
he would infuriate his own party. I mean, often. Churchill being Churchill, a normal day in the office was to drive his boss, the prime minister, absolutely berserk. That was standard operating procedure for Churchill. But it wasn't so much about, I'm going to do this to undermine him. I mean, if he was all about power, undermining the prime minister and really having a whole bunch of his party ticked off at him, not a smart political move, but it wasn't so much about power. It was about advocating for what he believed in. And that's really what a life of significance is. It's not about you. It's about believing in a cause and a mission beyond yourself, which is how Churchill led his life. Again, it doesn't mean that he was right about every issue. He wasn't in the light of history. But he fought for what he believed in, and he fought with every fiber of his being, which to me is a life of significance.
Yeah, and I mean, we say all the time, right? Your own life of significance, folks, you don't have to win World War II for the nation of England in order to lead a life of significance. Those things can happen in smaller steps. He just so happens has a very outsized life of significance, but the principles behind it that we've been talking about apply to your life as well. And that leads me to the next question, Warwick, is that what can we learn from this big life that Winston Churchill lived that we've been talking about? What can we learn about the keys to having perseverance in our own lives from his outsized life?
Absolutely. I think, as we've been saying, Churchill had a cause that he gave the key years of his life to, and that was opposing Adolf Hitler and the rise of Nazi Germany. He believed they were a threat. He believed you needed to guard against that. Later on, when he was part of the time he was out of power in the late 40s and early 50s, he talked about the Iron Curtain falling over Europe. He talked about being on your guard against the rise of the Soviet Union. Right after World War II, not everybody probably saw that. Obviously, people did see the dangers of the Soviet Union later on in the late 40s and early 50s. But he had a tendency to see trouble before everybody else saw it. He had a tendency to advocate for things that he believed in. And so I think what you can see in Churchill's life is he fought his whole life for a cause bigger than himself, for something that he passionately believed in. If you're fighting for a cause that's beyond yourself, that you passionately believe in, it's a whole lot easier to have perseverance.
Right.
This cause matters. I may not win, people may not hear me, but I'm going to spend my life in advocating for a cause, a purpose that serves others that's bigger than myself. You can have the attitude, whether it fails or not, this is too important to fail, in the sense it's too important for me not to give it my all. We may fail, but it won't be through lack of trying or lack of perseverance. So that's the first key. And as we've been saying, Churchill's ability to forgive and not hold grudges and move on is awe-inspiring. We've talked about Chamberlain and Baldwin, two former political rivals in his own party, the Conservative Party, who he didn't hold grudges against. We spoke about 1945 and losing the election to the Labour Prime Minister, whose name was Clement Attlee. You had some people, some of his friends, bad-mouthing Attlee. I remember this is sort of the final blow when many would say, the British electorate votes me out of power. What lack of gratitude when I helped win World War II. But Churchill would have none of his friends bad-mouthing the Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. He basically said, in effect, he is our Prime Minister and he is worthy of respect. He just shut them down. He almost got angry at them. Don't you say bad words about Clement Attlee. He's our Prime Minister. So I think the point more generally is lack of forgiveness and holding grudges hold us back. Lack of forgiveness and holding grudges, it makes it so much harder to move forward and persevere. If you're anchored in the past with bitterness and anger, how in the world are you going to have enough energy to move forward? All your anger is consumed by almost a cauldron of grudges and lack of forgiveness. Now, whether or not you have a right to be angry is something else. We talk about forgiveness doesn't mean condoning past behavior or your past mistakes. But lack of forgiveness, it saps the life out of you. You don't have any energy to persevere, and you need as much energy as you can get to persevere through crucibles. Another key, as we've spoken of, is his happy family life, his wife and children, and his support system. We talk about Beyond the Crucible all the time about the importance of having a team of fellow travelers. He had that. He had people that believed in him, friends. He had, above all, a wife and children that absolutely believed in Winston Churchill. And we've also spoken about having outside interests. Persevering for a cause greater than yourself is great, but you've got to have outside interests to help stop you burning out, to help rejuvenate you, recharge the batteries. It could be faith, it could be meditation, it could be a walk in the woods, it could be exercise, it could be some people have hobbies with woodwork. I mean, it can be all sorts of things that are your interest to help you rejuvenate. In Churchill's case, it was painting and a place in the country that he loved to relax and rejuvenate. So you've got to have outside interest, outside outlets to help you recharge the battery so that you can enter once more into the fray and do battle for a cause beyond yourself that you believe in.
Yeah. And I'll once again say Churchill also had this as part of his outside interest, the great big fat cigar.
Indeed.
There's another quote, Warwick, that I dug up that I think really puts a cap on this nicely. This idea of what we can learn about perseverance from him. He said this: every day you may make progress. Every step may be fruitful, yet there will stretch out before you an ever lengthening, ever ascending, ever improving path. You know you will never get to the end of the journey, but this, so far from discouraging, only adds to the joy and glory of the climb. I mean, as someone who arranges words into sentences and has for 40 years to earn a living, I mean, I read stuff like that and I'm just like, man, I know all those words. I know every single one of the words I just read. I never thought to put them in that order. That's one of the things that makes Churchill so inspiring. And that's one of the things we can take from one of the ways that he can help us have perseverance is he can use his words to inspire us to do just that.
So true. Yeah, just this idea that we talk a bit about nowadays is the importance of the journey. It's not just about the destination. It's
right.
How you live your life, crucible to crucible, day to day, month to month, year to year. It was all about the journey and all about, onward, upward, persevering. I guess the final comment he made in his life, I think shortly before he died, when he said something to the effect of, it's been a great journey, a fun journey, but it's worth doing only once. It's like, it's been a fine journey, but once is enough. Basically, he was ready for. It's been a great journey, but even in death, he had a witty quote.
And it's in your book, folks. If you haven't picked up Warwick's book, Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here is included in that book. And I just found the quote from the book, and you're almost exactly right. Your memory's good. Yeah. He said, "The journey has been enjoyable and well worth making. Once!" Exclamation point.
Exactly. Only Churchill. I could come close to trying to remember it, but only Churchill can put it so pithily and so perfectly.
Yeah. And again, that's one of the things, right? That's, as we've said, that's one of the things that inspires people to keep going, to not hide under the covers when crucibles hit. If someone like Churchill, from his earliest days that we've talked about here, where he endured crucibles when he was younger, and then there are the crucibles that maybe none of us will, or few of us will deal with in terms of a public life. Through it all, he was pretty consistent in having that spirit of next day, next opportunity, next thing to go. So let me ask you the final question, Warwick, as we wrap here. What are the big takeaways from Churchill's life we discussed today that can help our listeners and viewers make their own unique vision, whatever that may be, whatever size that may be? What are some things from Churchill's life that we talked about that can help them make their vision a reality?
Gary, when I think about Winston Churchill and the incredible life he lived, certainly a life well lived, it was Churchill's ability to make his vision a reality. All depended on perseverance. And really his vision was not so much being prime minister, it was fighting the good fight, advocating for his beliefs. Whether people listened or not, he would make sure that his position was well known. He would fight for what he believed in. And ultimately, it did become reality in the full sense of the word. He became prime minister. He, helped defeat Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. But, inevitably, there are going to be crucibles in our life. They may feel life-shattering, life-altering, but, to fight the good fight, to have your dreams become true, to make your vision a reality, you have to have perseverance. And I realize Winston Churchill had like Olympic-level perseverance, but, the battle is fought day in, day out. What perseverance do I need to have today? I need to get out of bed. I need to take one step forward. It's the perseverance needed to take one step forward. In Churchill's case, okay, I've got the speech. We've rescued 330,000 soldiers from Dunkirk. Okay, I need to give a speech. I need to write it out, memorize it. Off we go. That's tonight's task. He often worked all hours of the night writing speeches. Okay, the job at hand is to write this speech. And it might seem daunting, but okay, you start, as you would know, you start one word at a time. Okay, let's figure the first sentence and the next sentence and the third sentence. Okay, let's go back and rewrite it. I think it was pretty good, but I'm not looking for pretty good. I'm looking for excellent, if not epic level of writing. So let's fix it, but one word, one sentence at a time. I think the other point is, having perseverance enables you to move beyond crucibles to make a vision a reality and lead a life of significance. You want to lead a life of significance, you've got to have perseverance, because it's just not easy. Without perseverance, your vision won't become reality, and that's why it's all inextricably linked. It's easier to make your vision a reality if you're off the charts passionate about it. How can you be off the charts passionate about your vision? Well, if it's something beyond yourself, if it fulfills a higher purpose, if it's serving others, if it's what we call a life of significance. Of course, you're going to be off the charts passionate about something that you believe to the core in every fiber of your being that will help you have perseverance. So it's sort of it's almost like a flywheel, if you will. Having perseverance helps you make your vision a reality and lead a life of significance. Knowing that you want to lead a life of significance and you're having a vision that you believe in will help you have the perseverance to make it happen and have a life of significance. So it's a flywheel. One supports the other. But having perseverance is an absolute key part of it.
I've been, folks, in the communications business long enough to know when the last word's been spoken on a subject, and our host, Warwick Fairfax, just spoke it, dare I say, in Churchillian fashion. That was very well said, Warwick. That was very, very, very well articulated. And folks, that will wrap up the 6th episode of what we call our series within the show on stories from the book Crucible Leadership. So we will, here comes the pun, turn the page next month to another story to help you move beyond your crucible and move toward a life of significance. We'll see you then. If you enjoyed this episode, learned something from it, we invite you to engage more deeply with those of us at Beyond the Crucible. Visit our website, beyondthecrucible.com, to explore a plethora of offerings to help you transform what's been broken into breakthrough. A great place to start? Our free online assessment, which will help you pinpoint where you are on your journey beyond your crucible and to chart a course forward. See you next week.